It's a pleasure to introduce our speaker for the third China lecture of the Center for Emerging Markets at the Mao and Markets School of Business at Northeastern University. It is a pleasure to introduce Professor Chris Marquis, who is the Sinyi Professor of Chinese Management at Cambridge Judge Business School in the UK, England, and he's also a fellow at Jesus College in Cambridge. He has a PhD from Michigan University and an undergraduate from Northeastern University. He's a world expert in organizational theory, sustainability and innovation, and Chinese studies. Today, he's joining us for the third China lecture to present his book that came out by Yale University Press in 2022, entitled Mao and Markets. This book is published, it's co-authored with Kunyan Chao, who is going to be an assistant professor at Northeastern University in our department starting in the fall. This is a very special book because it has many awards, but the one that caught my attention in December, it was nominated as the best book in economics by the Financial Times of 2002, and it has received many other awards. It's a very easy to read book, very interesting book about politics and markets. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Chris. He will present around 40 minutes, and then we'll turn it over for questions that is going to be moderated by my colleague, Professor Ravi Ramamurthy, who is the director of the Center of Emerging Markets at the Mao and Markets. Welcome, everybody. I see a lot of names here that I recognize, so I'm really glad to see everybody here, and we hope to learn a lot on China, markets, and Mao. Back to you, Chris.
Great. Well, no, thank you so much, Ruth. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Northeastern, for having me. Just really, quite an honor and a pleasure to be here. Actually, delivering the lecture from Boston, which I just love being in and seeing old friends like all of you in person and online. So thank you all for joining. Like Ruth said, I'll be presenting for around 40 minutes. Really looking forward to your questions, comments. That's the sort of exciting part for me. So please be thinking about what you can contribute to our conversation as well. Please do put them in the chat, although sometimes when the chat gets long, it's hard to monitor. So when we turn to the Q&A, if you put something in the chat, please also feel free to raise your hand. That will just make sure that I don't miss it. I know that I've had that problem before, missing things. So, as Ruth mentioned, the book is called Mao and Markets, and it's really the product of about 10 years of research that Kunyan and I have been doing on. We are both professors in business schools, and so our background is really trying to sort of understand business dynamics around the world. China is obviously a really important center of our work, and China has the unique system of actually very close ties between the government, the Chinese Communist Party, and business. And so we've been trying to really more deeply understand this in our papers, and we wrote this book with an intention of taking some of that academic research, which we hope is rigorous, and presenting in a way that the general public can also understand and appreciate it. So that was sort of our goal, because really I think a lot of the motivation for my work on China has really been spurred by my own personal experience and my experience teaching on China. So this graph here, many of you probably have seen perhaps in the past, the sort of lines of Chinese GDP over the past 40 now years since reform and opening. After Mao died in 1976, Deng Xiaoping took over in 1978 and started this reform and opening period, where China started to adopt market institutions and reform its economy. And you can see the blue line being China's GDP growth rate. And over this 40-year period, grew at almost 10% a year. For 40 years, that is absolutely astounding and basically unheralded in world history. You know, you see countries like Japan or Korea that also, you know, emerged, you know, earlier. You know, they grew at that rate for maybe 15 years at most, and China has sustained this for over 10 years, so or 40 years, excuse me. So really a tremendously impressive economic achievement. The comparison is the U.S., which you can see there, which is much, you know, much lower. The bars, however, you know, point to a bit of a paradox, at least for how we see things in the West. You know, there is now about 100 million Chinese Communist Party members, and you know, many people have sort of said to me, "Oh, you know, sort of, you know, the communism and vibrant markets. I mean, this is sort of like oil and water." And I must say, some of my personal experience when I used to, for a long time, when I was at Harvard Business School, I was at Cornell for a while, I would take students to China many years. I've, you know, 5 or 6 years in the past, I've actually done that. We go and we visit a bunch of companies and cities and great cultural, you know, cultural places as well. And every year, a student would take me aside and say, you know, China is really not a communist country, you know, because they would see these amazing markets. They would see the gleaming buildings, the incredible infrastructure, high-speed train, you know, rail, you know, subways that are just astounding. And this is, from the West, the exact opposite from what we sort of expect, and what the media, politicians, and general public describe. They, you know, the expectation is that, you know, communism is, you know, sort of slow moving, going to collapse under its own weight, not efficient. But here, you know, China has, you know, 100 million Communist Party members and perhaps the most amazing economic growth story in history. So how to reconcile these two items in a way that actually helps inform our understanding and maybe helps overturn some of the, what we think are misperceptions in how the West has seen China. And in the book, you know, it's partially an aim to try to understand from sort of first principles, from the roots, the different, in some ways, ideological and market elements in China, but also implicitly a critique of how the West has misunderstood China. And, you know, basically, as this slide says, what the West got wrong about China. So these are now, you know, somewhat, I mean, these are not, I don't think, going to be super surprising to anyone. I think when we were writing the book, they were a little more surprising, but they've certainly been discussed a bit. So one is this idea that with globalization, economic development, there will be political liberalization. You know, this drove basically 3 to 4 decades of US and Western policy towards China. When China joined the WTO in 2001, you know, President at the time, Bill Clinton, sort of famous for saying, you know, free markets are a one-way street. This will lead to democratization and liberalization in China. And this has clearly not occurred. And, you know, by many accounts, actually, China has gotten even, you know, less sort of free and open over the last number of years under Xi Jinping. Another sort of myth, so to speak, that I think impedes our understanding is that, you know, communism is some sort of monolithic entity as a system, and that, you know, the Soviet Union ended up collapsing and failing. And so, you know, likely would happen in China. This is, you're probably familiar with, you know, sort of The End of History, Francis Fukuyama, The Coming Collapse of China is a book. And this is just the idea that, you know, in the world today, in the globalized world with, you know, trade, et cetera, there will be, again, sort of in some ways, this rush to free markets, and the people that are living in those places will become unsatisfied and overcome. Again, sort of didn't happen. A third, which is perhaps a little more, I think the jury, some of you, I think you could have a stronger pushback to me on this one as far as whether the jury is still out or not on this, is the extent of flexibility of the Chinese government. So another, in some ways, narrative to try to understand China is that when Deng Xiaoping took power in 1978 and had the reform and opening policy, that this was a flexible way and really a very sort of thoughtful way of combining sort of state and market. That's a cartoon of Deng Xiaoping there. He has a black cat and a white cat, and sort of famously said things like, it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. So the idea that, okay, maybe the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is not as sort of rigid and dogmatic as maybe the Soviets, and there's an ability to have an openness to sort of a variety of different systems and be flexible. We're going to actually try to debunk this a little bit as well and describe sort of the continuity of political institutions that really maintain, in some ways, the sort of hardline policies of Mao, which then can get implemented by Xi Jinping. And so, in the last number of years, people have seen Xi as really a sort of surprise and aberration, because you have this 40 years of much more openness. And in many ways, one implicit message of our book is that that actually maybe the Deng period is the aberration. So these are some myths that we're trying to, in some ways, correct understanding of and understand China from a little bit more first principles. One of the reasons why we think, particularly the first two of those, sort of myths that have been busted, are sort of are an issue, or have been very, leaders in political arena and also business have been susceptible to fall into, is that there is a confirmation bias around. I think in general, I mean, this is something as most of all of you don't know, a psychological process where people look for evidence that confirm their existing beliefs. And I think personally, I see this playing out again and again, and even today. So I think we're coming out of COVID. I think the West, I think Western business wants to be able to go in, reestablish their business and markets in China. And many of the messages that Chinese leaders are articulating to outward-facing audiences is about, we are open, we want you to come and do business. You see here Liu He, the upper left-hand side, sort of one of the chief economic leaders at Davos, saying China's open for business. This guy here in the middle is the new premier of China, just appointed at the National People's Congress a month ago, Li Qiang, saying at the National People's Congress, we really support private business. Xi Jinping himself, there's recently a China Development Forum just in the past weeks, also articulates this idea that China's open. I think that, these are messages that I think are very much being communicated because this is what, there's an interest in having continued investment. And I think that the West is very susceptible to hearing this. And I think, looking, at, not what leaders are saying to the outside world, but more what leaders are saying to sort of closed door Chinese Communist Party gatherings, is maybe a more accurate understanding, provides a more accurate insight into actually what's going on the ground. This was reported about the same time as a little bit after Liu He's statement, where she was meeting with a group of sort of senior Chinese Communist Party members, and basically saying, we're going to double down on our sort of self-reliance, rejecting Western model. And I think too, you see, and we can talk about this in discussion, many of the things like golden shares, which are small equity stakes that the Chinese Communist Party and government are taking in tech firms and other firms that give them a board seat and veto rights, the expansion of sort of party branches and leadership within firms, a variety of other things we can talk about in the Q&A, make me question actually the extent to which the government and the CCP is open for private enterprise. And so, I think that trying to sort of understand some of these myths, I think, has a lot of relevance for the current day too, because we may be sort of susceptible to some of the messages around openness, because we think this is how we in the West would want to operate. So of course, this is how the Chinese will do. And that sort of assumption, I think, has been proven to be wrong. One of the things I think that we try to really explain and understand in the book, part of the issue with this confirmation bias is that there is fundamentally different ways of thinking cognitively between the East and the West. This is longstanding research in psychology. Cross-cultural psychology has described how in the West, there's much more of a focus on identifying differences between items and separating them into different categories. So this, I think, is manifest in, if you look at like how the state market political parties are, are sort of discrete entities, potentially in competition. This, sort of makes sense to us and how we think. I think that the graph that would describe the Chinese system is a bit more like this, where actually the state, market, and military I have on there are all actually under the umbrella of the Chinese Communist Party. So sure, Deng Xiaoping can say it doesn't matter if it's a black cat or a white cat. Well, because both of those cats report into the CCP. So it's a situation where, not where there's competition between these different sectors, but actually, they both, are controlled by this party, which is obviously a very different type of party than in the US, where we have Democrat and Republican Party. Some of my Chinese friends are sort of surprised. I mean, I'm actually, registered as a Democrat in America, and they're surprised that if I just tomorrow I wanted to register as Republican, this would be like not a problem at all. So this idea of being part of a party is very different. And I think that this actually difference in issue, it's cognitive or just lack of understanding the system, manifest as well in the recent hearings about TikTok on Capitol Hill, where many of the Congress people were sort of quizzing and grilling the CEO about Chinese laws. And certainly, laws are even a little important in China. I'm not saying that they're not fully, but there is not a rule of law system where you could have a situation where the president gets sued. You've seen, former President Trump. I was actually in New York this morning. Lots of hubbub there about him. That's a former president. He actually came under some sort of legal scrutiny when he was president. I mean, the fact of this potentially happening to Xi Jinping is laughable, almost. And so I think that in the US Congress, when they're asking about laws, I think it's like sort of extrapolating our system in a way that doesn't get at the essence of really what is the party control. And I think that that, in my opinion, the Congress people missed the boat. I mean, some of them asked about the party control and golden shares, but that should have been much more the focus, as opposed to what the Chinese government and Chinese laws allow to do, because those are all, subservient to the CCP. So that is really one of the things we want to try to dive into in the book. Okay, so to understand this influence of the CCP and ideology and institutions that were really laid down in a significant way during the early periods of the party. This is, so the revolution 1949, but then also Mao's experience before then. We try to dig into the different principles of Mao, the different campaigns that he initiated, and some of the institutions that to get a deep understanding of in some ways, what the underlying institutional infrastructure is, the ideology is, and then we can trace that through to the business environment, depending on different characteristics of the entrepreneurs and the extent to which they have actually been exposed to that through their socialization and upbringing. Okay. The sort of theoretical perspective that we take is known as imprinting. And this is the idea that sort of early leaders and experiences have a lasting influence later. So, this is not something where, it's specific to sort of Mao and China, but there's been work on, early leaders in the US, like the longstanding influence of people like Jefferson or Hamilton. There's been work on King Louis XIV and his lasting influence on a variety of institutions in Germany as well. So this is a sort of well-established set of ideas that actually by having influence on early institutions, which then are inert, path dependent, so to speak, and the ideology that there's a lasting effect of early leaders. Let me say just a little bit before diving into sort of how the two pillars, as we describe it, of this, one ideology and the other being institutions. So one thing in a very sort of basic way, people that join, so the 100 million or so people that have joined the Chinese Communist Party, which is a little bit under 10%, go through a very intensive socialization, indoctrination process of, having meetings, reading texts, watching documentaries, working with mentors, eventually, giving an oath to sort of uphold the values and basically place the CCP first. This typically happens at a time period when people are very open to influence, sort of the end of as they're sort of transitioning from their family home into the broader world. But this doesn't just happen to those individuals when they go through, sort of the socialization of the party. Actually, these are things, sort of ideas that are continually promoted and advocated in the Chinese education system and society. So one of the other, in some ways, impetuses behind my sort of trying to understand this is, when I was at Cornell, I was on an admission panel one year, and this was for PhD students, and I was scanning a application, and I saw on the application that sort of Chinese transcript, and the Chinese characters Mao Zedong sort of popped off the page to me as I was scrolling through this. So that's interesting. This student is studying something about Mao, and I went and saw, and I think it was like sort of Mao Zedong Sishang, which is like Maoism and socialism for a new era. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And then I noticed it was actually a required class. And then I noticed actually the student had taken 2 of these classes. And I was like, required class, that's interesting. I looked at all the other Chinese students, and all the other Chinese students had taken that. And sure enough, it's been, people have reported to me that basically, from earliest days through college, people are taking required classes in Maoism and in sort of CCP ideology, whether or not they are CCP members or not. Many people say, well, I really don't believe that, but anyways, it's being exposed to those ideas over a long period of time. I don't think you can really discount them that much. I mean, just my own personal experience. I was raised a Catholic, and many of the sort of early ideas I was exposed to, I do think still sort of affect my cognition. So I think it's a natural thing if you're sort of exposed to things over and over. I should note as well, sort of an interesting sort of anecdote. So the one student that I originally saw this on, I then looked at the English translation of that transcript, and it was described as Chinese philosophy, was actually the English translation of that. So also there's a lot of, the CCP's centenary was just a few years ago. And there, that was a really amazing, example of how these Maoist and CCP ideas are being promoted through cultural production. So lots of films, I think movie theaters, actually, they had to show certain amounts of these revolutionary movies. There was a redoing of the official history of the Chinese Communist Party. Tourism, red tourism promoted. I've actually been to Mao's hometown, which is sort of an interesting tourist location. It's in Hunan province, which is not a place that non-Chinese frequently go, but I was visiting a company in the capital of Hunan, Changsha. Interestingly enough, actually, there's a giant statue of Mao's head. I mean, this is, I don't know, maybe 50, 100 meters high statue of just his head in the middle of in this island in the middle of the river. But I wanted to go to see his hometown. It was a couple hours drive away. Company I was visiting thought it was a little strange that I would want to go see that, but they were very kindly, provided me a driver and a car and take me there. And it was really kind of amazing because, I've been to a lot of different, historical sites in the US, you would think are similar to it. So Mount Vernon, I've been to, the home of George Washington, Monticello, home of Thomas Jefferson. And these are very, I don't know, sort of quiet, I guess you would describe them, very limited number of, very sort of scholarly type visitors, not really sort of on the hot tourist trail. But this was much more, I think, the Mao, the Shaoshan is the name of his town, much more like Graceland, actually. It was overrun by mostly rural Chinese coming in some ways to pay homage. There, long lines to get into his house, which is surprisingly big, that I found. And also markets all over the place. I mean, it was a vibrant, tourist, very, very active sort of tourist. I actually bought a statue of Mao there, marked with his hometown. So if anyone visits me in Cambridge, you can see my Mao statue. So anyways, I guess, my point here is that not only through the CCP socialization, but also through continual cultural exposure, these ideas continue, last, which is, for this imprinting theory, an important sort of aspect. Also, I would say beyond just the ideology and culture, the institutions, sort of the formal elements of the Chinese bureaucracy and state also are very, very important. So, Deng Xiaoping, I mentioned 1978, had this reform and opening. So again, I think this is another example of the West's interest in seeing what they want to see and confirmation bias. I think some strategy probably on the Chinese part too, in what to communicate, but So the reform and opening policy, which Deng articulated, later written into the Chinese constitution, is actually the second of what he described as two basic points. The first basic point had a series of, maintaining the Chinese Communist Party at the center of politics, adhering to Mao Zedong thought, and a couple other things. There's actually four of them. So this was packaged directly with reform and opening, but we in the West don't really acknowledge or even know about. We see reform and opening. Also, Mao has continued to be emphasized as a foundational leader in China, despite tens of millions of people dying because of his, leadership errors around the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, and tens of millions of other sort of, persecuted or living in poor conditions, still is very sort of deified in many ways. And this is directly a result of what the CCP thinks as a failure of the Soviets. And one of the reasons why the Soviet Union and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union ended up failing is because they negated the legacy of Stalin. So this was seen as a big error of Khrushchev, who followed Stalin. There's documentaries in the CCP, recently, I forget what the title of them is, but basically lays the failure of the Soviet Union for not actually upholding the leadership of Stalin. Recent, sort of histories of China are about the, how the, sort of Mao's legacy is sort of, fundamental to the CCP. So anyways, so this is, again, sort of an example of how, not just in the cultural realm, but also in the institutional realm, Mao's ideas stick. And I'm being a little too verbose, so I'm going to go a little faster. Okay. So this is even more important now because Xi Jinping has emphasized these ideas much more so than his predecessors in this role, which were Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. And many people, I think, compare Xi Jinping to Mao. And perhaps that's a reasonable comparison. He does say, he does draw on Mao's language. He purposely imitates him at times. But I would say that some of those comparisons probably are a bit too simplistic. And where we think perhaps we can provide some insight is sort of understanding the, in some ways, levers that Mao created and ideas that Mao created help maybe understand some of Xi Jinping's ideas. I'm not going to talk a ton about that. We can talk more about it in the Q&A. Okay, just to give you a sense of the sort of research we did for this. Again, as I mentioned on the first page, this is a result of many peer-reviewed journal articles using lots of different data sources. So the key data, we look at the survey of entrepreneurs that is carried out by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences back into the 1990s. The SISMAR database, some of you that do research on China might be familiar with this. It's basically data on Chinese public companies. So we can look at sort of the leaders of these firms, their backgrounds, how they were influenced in a variety of ways by these different Maoist ideas, and see whether they're running their business differently because of being exposed to to different aspects of Maoist ideas. We also have data on politicians, which was hand-coded, and we examined also their backgrounds and how that affects how they engage with business in their localities. So these are, so we look at mayors. So within cities, like there's 330 cities at a certain level, and we look at the mayors and also the party chiefs of these cities with similar types of analyses, looking at background characteristics affecting more current day processes, like the entrepreneurs and the corporate leaders of publicly traded firms. We also did a variety of other things. We actually interviewed a lot of people. I myself have interviewed hundreds of executives in China and government people and nonprofit leaders, et cetera. For this project in particular, looking at these specific research questions we look at, we interviewed 32 people to really sort of try to understand their how they run their business based on some of what I'm going to be talking about. And I'll skip over some of this other stuff in addition in the influence time. So let me give you the basic structure of the book. I'm not going to be able to present the whole thing, obviously, in the next 10 minutes or so, but so we look at 3 different aspects of Maoist, of sort of Maoist influence and how they then affect business long term. So the first are ideological and military principles, and these are listed here. So things like self-reliance, independence, anti-foreign sentiment in some way, China standing up, and sort of taking its place in the world. Frugality, also something Mao emphasized, and emphasis on savings. And then also there was an important dictum around the mass line, which basically means that sort of the leaders and the CCP exist to serve the masses. And you see a lot of this actually around even in Xi Jinping sort of serving the people, et cetera. Military strategies are another very interesting element of Maoist ideas, and I'll say a little more about those. But there's a number of strategies that he used in the revolution, in defeating the Kuomintang, who eventually end up going to Taiwan, that business people use as strategies themselves. The second set of items that we look at, so the first part of the book is around these ideological military principles and how they last in China. The second is around these mass campaigns that we call them. Some of these I'm sure you're familiar with: the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, are the 2 probably most famous. This is something that was very characteristic of Mao. Other things, there's Yan'an rectification, which was early days of the CCP when he really sort of took control and sort of banished his enemies. Third front construction is another one where it's really very interesting, where China split with the Soviet Union in the 1960s, and so basically was isolated and fearful of the West and the US, and then also, and that was coming through the eastern seaboard potentially, and then to the west of China, big land border with Russia, also worried about military encroachment. And so a lot of the key infrastructure around the military, around industry, sensitive, crucial industries, were actually placed in the middle of China in very hard to reach mountainous areas. This was a campaign called the Third Front Construction, which still ends up affecting China. I don't know, some of you have probably been to Xi'an, where the terracotta warriors are. Actually, a lot of the sort of military aircraft was there, and still to this day, I visited. If you saw this in my office in Cambridge, in addition to a statue of Mao, I also have a model of China's sort of most advanced fighter jet, which was given to me when I visited a university in Xi'an. And this was because Xi'an is really a center of sort of military and aircraft and other technologies, a legacy of this Third Front construction. Socialist institutions, some of the things there are, mechanisms of, controlling the private economy. Obviously, state-owned enterprises are a very important element of the Chinese economic system. We do sort of consider them a bit, but to us, it's more interesting to look at how Mao influences private firms, because in some ways, by definition, state-owned firms are many of them are, parts of them are publicly traded companies, but they have a much sort of closer and deeper relationship with the CCP and state. So it's a little more obvious. So this is the structure of the book. I actually have slides on each of the parts in red, but in the interest of time, because I have way more material I now know that I can get through, I'll just go through them very, very quickly. One example we give, it's a very obvious example, is Huawei, which is, I've visited a number of, sort of Huawei's facilities over the years, truly amazing. I think it was something like 70% of their employees are in R&D. They patent like crazy, real leader in 5G, still gigantic company, although given the US sanctions have certainly decreased recently. But it's interesting, Ren Zhengfei, who is the founder and ostensibly the leader of Huawei, frequently describes, these are quotes of his here, you can see them here. And so be it what it may, again, I think this is sort of where the West really, and the US policymakers, you see a lot of discussion around, although less so now, around ownership, whether the state, whether Huawei is owned by the Chinese government. And from what I understand, it's actually not. It's actually the ownership is distributed among the employees. But you have the situation where the leader is very clear in his dedication, commitment to the CCP, and that he would put the CCP basically above all. And to me, the ownership question is somewhat a red herring. I think that the sort of commitment that is exhibited is really, again, similar to the TikTok thing I mentioned, where we should focus our attention. Okay, nationalism. Mao was a great nationalist. Had a lot of really important sort of ideas and rhetoric and promotion of nationalism. This, what we show in the paper, in the papers we've done in the book, is that if leaders were socialized in the CCP during Mao's era, they are much less likely to internationalize their firm and much less likely to accept foreign investment, is sort of one of the findings we have. And we think this is an interesting finding that actually tells a bigger story, because this was during a time period when the Chinese government was telling firms, go global. But these entrepreneurs that had this much deeper Maoist imprint around self-reliance, anti-foreign rhetoric are much less likely to do that. 50% less likely. You can see here some of the analyses we did, sort of using regression discontinuity techniques. And so this, as you can see here, in just investing abroad. And what we looked at are, I don't want to get too technical in this presentation, but so, we took the population of entrepreneurs, and this is thousands of, maybe even 10,000+ people over, these key years that had joined the CCP. So these are people, like if you say, oh, maybe, they have some dispositional interest in the ideas, which then affects whether they go foreign or not. So these are people that actually ended up joining the CCP, is sort of the sample of these folks. And so this break here is right basically, 1977, 1978. And so these people who were 18 by that time and older, so these are people that were sort of socialized into the CCP in 1975, 74, 73, 72, 71. This is their age. And these individuals are much less likely in a very substantial way to internationalize their firm, just in comparison to the people who were socialized into the CCP after this period. So anyway, so lots of evidence, and we qualitative evidence around why this is too, but I won't go into detail. Also, so this is a sample of entrepreneurs. We find similar things. There's actually finance papers that have now replicated our work using publicly traded firms, which we then also looking at sort of writings of the CEOs, and then also their foreign practices. Again, this socialization of the CCP, much less like I see Ravi, so I'm going to get going very quickly. Great. Nationalism still very, very important in China, today. Lots of crackdown on businesses. I'm going to say one last thing. I'm going to skip over actually the sections. One of the things that I think is very interesting, and this is something that we have a chapter on in the book, but more so just for completeness sake. Other people have made these points, like that that they have used how entrepreneurs have actually used Mao's military strategies. So, orthodox Marxist-Leninist theory is around organizing in cities from industrial labor. Marx, when he was writing, was in the UK, in London, thriving industrial centers in the Soviet Union as well. There was organization of, the proletariat. This strategy failed for a long time in China. And how Mao actually rose to power was with the insight that China is an agrarian country. We should be organizing the rural population and then sort of from the countryside surround the cities. And this strategy has now been used by scores of entrepreneurs. And I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's actually where the people are in China. And it's so, anyways, this is an example. There's a lot of other of Mao's military strategies that have also been used. Okay, just to go ahead, I was going to talk about the campaigns. I introduced a little bit of this already. Let me just go ahead. This I just to show some of the ability to engage in contradictions. Tencent, leading gaming and e-commerce and social media company in China. There is this cube outside of their business. And, it can say, they even have it in English, follow the party, start a business. I think this is, as we in the West think about communism, is the last thing you would think that actually following the party would want to do, but actually it's able to be combined in China in a very effective way. Okay. We can add in questions if people ask me about party branches. These are things that are in the news a lot, because they're used much more now from the CCP in ways of controlling private, sort of private enterprises. Also, multinationals are now subject to that. Here's, from Alibaba and Tencent. So, we can also talk some of the key conclusions. I think I've illustrated a bunch of them through different stories and findings, but yeah, basically, thank you very much for listening. Apologies for being a little bit too wordy, but again, really looking forward to the discussion and all of your comments and questions. So thank you, Ravi. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chris. I think we have a lot of questions piling
Great.
up in chat.
Super.
I thought I'd first ask you to hold up a copy of your book, which you have. I think.
Sure. Oh yeah, here it is.
You
right
just
here.
show us the graphic of it, but it's a mighty piece of work. If we can see the sideway view, see how thick it is.
It's and we even cut 20,000 words from it just because it's Yeah, it's about 400 pages, and the publisher, was very tight, and I guess it cost them, it cost them money to print longer books. So we were,
Yeah.
It's again a product of over a decade of work. So
amazing. Congratulations again.
Thank you.
It's very, very thoroughly researched and documented as well for those who want to go buy the book. Let me start by asking a question. I think Ed Wertheim had a question. He has to leave, or maybe he's already left. So maybe I'll have to ask his question. His question is about the demographic decline in China.
Yes.
And what are the implications? By the way, we have about 6 or 7 questions, and we have about 20 minutes. So
sure.
And probably there'll be a few more before we
finish.
No,
definitely. Thank you. Great. So this is something that is a huge challenge for China in the coming decades. I think, people probably have seen some of these demographic plots. China for a long time had a one-child policy, and that is something they wanted to control their population early on, but now are in the situation where there's going to be a lot more retirees than people working and feeding into the public coffers, so to speak. And it'll be a big sort of drain on resources, big drain on, potentially productivity of the country. A couple of things that I'll say, demography is not destiny per se. And I think that you think about a country like the UK in history, where I live now, very small in some ways, but also has built up a lot of very powerful industries and economic, sort of might. And I think that China is really thinking about ways of using its international footprint to supplement some of the domestic issues. You probably heard of the Belt and Road Initiative, which gets a lot of sort of mixed coverage in the Western press. But any of you who've been to China and seen the amazing, like high-speed rail. It's something. When last time I took students there in 2019, I remember we were taking rail somewhere. And one of the students said, how much rail, this high-speed rail is there in China? And we looked it up. And at the time, it was either 30,000 miles or 30,000 kilometers. I can't remember which one. I know that's a big difference. Excuse my sort of American focus on miles. But the important thing is not the amount. The important thing in some ways is that the second highest in the world were like Germany and Japan, and they had around 3,000. So China is 10,000. It's going to be 10 times. So the country is very saturated, and I think they have expertise in building ports and building airports, and so they have done a very effective, trying to get other countries to sort of adopt those different systems. And I think that's an important way for them to continue to for China to continue to potentially grow. I think through automation, now there's the ability to automate things, so some of the factories can be automated. I think these are some of the strategies they're trying to help overcome the huge demographic cliff that they're facing. But it's definitely an open question, and I don't have any strong prognosis. I know that the sort of focused on automation and focused on sort of export of technologies is very active as to try to get over that issue, and we'll see.
Renato has a question that's more directly tied to your work, so
Sure.
I don't want to miss that. And that is about how come with all of these great China centers and studies and experts in the U.S., the U.S. government has made so many mistakes in its readings about China. And what do you think the scenario is for U.S.-China relations? I know that's a big question. Yeah. Can you give us a 3-minute answer?
Sure. All right, so I'll say something that I don't know, might be sort of I don't know if it's a little controversial or kind of say, I don't know what the right term is. So this morning, actually, I was in New York and I actually gave a presentation at the Council on Foreign Relations.
Mm.
One of the participants said really, interesting question, said, 50 years from now, we may be reading a book called Modi and Markets. And how should the US in a proactive fashion engage with India based on your study? Which I think sort of, and I said, I'm not an expert in India. I don't actually know that much about, Prime Minister Modi or what's going on there. But what actually struck me as I was thinking about it is actually how different my experience has been as an academic in the UK versus the US. In the UK, I have found a much greater interest from politicians and from business on engaging with academia. I think in the US, academia is a little bit more sort of an ivory tower. And I think, there's a little bit more of like a little bit of an anti-intellectual bias, certainly among sort of some of our political parties. And I think that some of these issues, I think impede, in-depth understanding and knowledge. And so I think also I don't know if there's any sort of economists in the room. I apologize. I'll also bash economists. I think a lot of the problems are that, okay, we have, economic development theory says that, opening up markets will lead to democratization. And in the US, there's a Council of Economic Advisors. And I think we miss a lot of the important sort of ideology, culture, effective norms. So anyways, I think that I would say that, it's hard, I'm obviously, not an economist, I'm trained as a sociologist, have a bias, but I think that the people who were advising the US government on China were the wrong people and not really academics. They were people like Hank Paulson and Larry Summers and other people that are either not academics or economists.
On that issue, very quickly, I don't want to hog the airtime.
No, please.
It raises a question of if you flip the roles and look at how China tries to understand the US.
Yeah.
Could you comment on that very briefly?
Sure. And this is something more broadly that I actually have a tremendous worry about the US. So I don't know if you can tell from my presentation, but I'm a little very skeptical of the Chinese Communist Party and leadership of China. But I am very much pro engaging with China, not like many of the people that might be sort of similar skepticism to me that focus on decoupling. And I think it's because we need to keep, learning and understanding. If we don't keep, sort of economic exchange, academic exchange, we're only going to hurt ourselves, really, in the long term. And I think in China, about 10 times more, maybe 20 times more students from China study in the US and West than US students study in China. American, movies, entertainment for many, many years, were some of the most popular things, cultural products. You go to top Chinese universities, many of the faculty have actually spent time in the US, been educated in the US. And so I think that there is a much deeper well of understanding. And I think in the US, it's a huge, huge problem. Just in the last number of years, COVID contributed to this, but there was under 400 American students studying in China. I don't know what that is, a tremendously low number, I think. There's hundreds of thousands. I mean, some universities, I think, Ruth's old school, UIUC, I think some years has like over 3,000, maybe even at the undergraduate level, it's 3,000 Chinese students. It's probably graduates even more. So, I mean, we are really, shooting ourselves in the foot long term by not promoting cultural engagement, academic exchange, business exchange. I think all of this, all this sort of anti-Asian discourse and hate is another sort of horrible thing that has been an issue recently. So I think we need to keep engaging as much as possible, because clearly the Chinese have a deeper understanding of us because of all these person-to-person educational exchanges, et cetera.
Interesting. Thank you. Carmen, I see you. If you're still there, would you like to ask your question? You'll have to unmute. Yeah. Right.
Hi, how are you? Thank you very much, dear professor.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you much for your presentation. I have a question. I am from Guatemala, and we have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, China. And I think we're the only country in Central America that we have diplomatic relations with Taiwan.
Okay.
I want to ask you, what will be the benefits of us leaving Taiwan and engaging in diplomatic relations with China?
Wow, that is a tough one. And I think, I think Honduras recently, just in the last couple of weeks, actually ended their diplomatic relations with Taiwan and switched over to mainland China. Yeah. Wow. So a couple things. So one, I don't know how many, in some ways, countries that still recognize Taiwan anymore. There's like maybe 10 in the world. I don't know. 13. Okay. 13. I think, or was it 12? Because I think, or was there 13 before Honduras, or it's 13 after Honduras?
After Honduras.
Yeah. So, I mean, in some ways, this has now been, literally, I don't know, since 1949, that the mainland government has been, sort of under the, it's been a separate government than in Taiwan. So, I can understand for a long time, maybe people want to stick with Taiwan because of ideological reasons. And certainly, I just was in Taiwan a month ago. I'm a supporter of Taiwan in many ways, but sort of the reality of the world is that the mainland, China is the mainland China, and I think there's rationale to sort of have diplomatic relations with them because of that reason. I don't know if this impedes whether people from Guatemala can go to China or not, engage with China economically, but I think there's China is one of the arguably one of the top 2 most important countries in the world, and I think to engage with them more deeply, I think probably makes sense for Guatemala as a country and the Guatemalan people.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you, dear professor.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Carmen.
Yeah. Ruth, you had a question? Would you like to ask it yourself?
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation, Chris. Very, very interesting. My question is, what is the role of gender? Because, we see all these, we see the PCC, the Chinese political party, the Chinese Communist Party, almost all men. Like I was looking at boards recently and top management teams in public and state-owned companies in China, mostly men, and it's different than in other even Southeast Asian countries. So what is the story there?
Yeah, very interesting for a couple of reasons. So one, a big, sort of propaganda effort is around actually, the Chinese support of women this phrase, women hold up half the sky, actually is from Mao. Joe Biden actually quoted this when he appointed, sort of introduced Kamala Harris as his vice president. I don't think he realized he was quoting Mao when he was saying that. And I think you'll hear a lot in China. I've given actually talks a couple times at conferences on gender and leadership in China when I was at HBS. And so there's a lot of talk around it, but like you're saying, talk is cheap, and in reality, there's very low representation of women. You look at the political leadership in China as well, this sort of the Politburo, the top 25 or so leaders, just recently, the one that was just recently appointed did not even have one woman. And this is like the first time in like 30 years that there was not even one woman. What people explained to me is that still, despite some of this discourse, very patriarchal, male-dominated society, and so that's, I think it definitely has something to do with it. Thank you, Ruth. Ravi, I think you're on mute, Ravi.
I had a question going to the sort of the thesis of your book, and that has to do with whether some of the tipping of the hat to Mao and so on, is that to be taken as ideological or simply pragmatic? Because it serves as a convenient way to centralize power in the party and even within the party in the leadership. So is it simply a tool, or is that really a deep faith and belief in some underlying ideology?
Super important question. I think that in some ways it cuts right to the heart of what we're trying to do, and it's a challenging thing that we're trying to do, and sort of to really understand and try to make these claims around ideology. And I think the common economic explanation for in these, ties to CCP, influence of Mao, is very much more around, instrumental reasons like getting benefits, for the company. And one of the things that really spurred my interest in doing this, sort of examining this, or sort of stuck with me for a long time, is so from 2010 to 2020, I spent a lot of time living in China, researching Chinese companies, interviewing Chinese managers. I was at the time at Harvard Business School, so I had pretty good access to Chinese leaders. And I went and visited in 2011 the head of China's largest shipping company, Costco. And the leader, he spoke very good English. He was one of the first companies that adopted the UN Global Compact. Very international. They operated ports in Boston, operated ports in LA. Really very. But I had met him before. Very engaging, charismatic person. Walked into his office, and staring right at me was a life-size statue of Mao. And this was and so I thought about this. Is this just display? Is this something he sort of has to do as being part of this state-owned firm to sort of, look, be legitimate? So I think that is in some ways, realistic, explanation. And one of the reasons why, we try to examine through the sort of larger databases we have, how these different socialization experiences end up being in some ways echoed in later business behavior, because many of the actually, this sort of anti-foreign rhetoric, even like sort of focus on mass line, it's more like we look at that sort of more CSR, basically, arguably can be said as, sort of being economically inefficient for the firm, but still, they, given these early socialization experiences, are still actually, engaging in this. And I think that this is important to recognize for our current day that these are, for many of these people, I do, our analysis suggested, and I do believe, sort of deeply held beliefs, because in the West, I think there is this thought that people want to be like us, they want to have open markets, they want to sort of have a democratic political system. And for instance, Foreign Affairs, Kevin Rudd, who was the former Prime Minister of Australia, deeply educated in China, is now the Australian ambassador to the US. He had an article and he described how, Xi Jinping is really like a new ideological turn in China. And back when he was in China, he would have these discussions with these Communist Party leaders, and it would be like wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Of course, we don't believe any of this communist stuff. We just have to say it. And I think that's a dangerous assumption to make. So I think that's a really important question. In some ways, sort of trying to understand that is what motivated this whole project. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I think we have time for one last question.
Yeah.
We have 2 minutes left. So Iliam, if you could ask your question quickly, and Chris may respond quickly as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chris, for your presentation. Very interesting, and it's very revealing for Western audiences, and you are challenging the assumptions that are common in the West. My question, when Chinese readers go through your book, do they see something surprising? Is there something that they might not agree with, or sort of not so sure about? To what extent it might be surprising, revealing for Chinese readers?
Yeah, so I think that, it's interesting, because I think that many times, sort of in some ways, culture is taken for granted, and many of the Chinese readers, they actually didn't realize the depth of the influence of Mao on their country. And so the Foreign Affairs thing, event that I mentioned earlier, or excuse me, not Foreign Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations, the person that introduced me said, actually using this break in 1976 to understand fundamental differences between political and business leaders seems obvious now, but actually was not something that they had actually thought about. So, the sort of culture is, for all of us that grew up in it, is natural in how things are done, and we don't typically examine it. So that's sort of one of the things that Chinese readers have said to me, that it's, sort of, I guess, help them understand some of the roots of maybe some of the sort of assumptions or beliefs that they have.
Thank you.
Great, thank you for the question.
Almost exactly on the dot, 6:15. Thank you, Chris. I mean, this is such a complex topic, and such an important topic, and the relationship is so important, not just for the two countries, but for the entire world. So thank you for, spending the 10 years trying to understand it and communicate that with us. I think you only scratched the surface, because your book has so much more.
Yeah.
So I would suggest to everyone, buy a copy of the book and read it. It's got lots of interesting tidbits and anecdotes and nuances that flesh out the central argument. So thank you, Chris, again for doing this.
Yes.
And,
thank you, Ravi, and thank you all for coming, and really honored and grateful for the opportunity to be at Northeastern again. So thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, audience, and hope to see you in one of our future events. Good night. Goodbye.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.